All right, friends, we are going to be opening back up to Luke. I know y'all were ready for it last week. We're actually going to get there this week. Luke chapter 12. If you turn over there, we're going to be starting in verse 35 this morning. And I apologize for any little baby coughs I might have in between here. I'm going to do my best this morning. All right, let's read from Luke 12. Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like men waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. I tell you the truth, he will dress himself ready to serve, will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the second or the third watch of the night. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Peter asked, Lord, are you telling this parable to us or to everyone? The Lord answered, Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. I tell you the truth, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose the servant says to himself, My master is taking a long time in coming. And then he begins to beat the men servants and maid servants, and to eat and to drink and to get drunk. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. That servant who knows his master's will and does not get ready, or does not do what his master wants, will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and who does things deserving punishment will be beaten with few blows. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one whom has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I remember in college, there was a couple different types of classes you may take. A couple of different formats that the teachers would often have class in. On one of those formats, the teacher would get there. You'd get there the first day, and the teacher would hand you your syllabus and say, "Hey, you guys will be tested. There'll be one test in the middle of the semester, midterm, and you'll have one test at the end of the semester." A final. And I had several of those classes. Maybe you did too. Sometimes it would even be, hey, we're just going to have one test at the end of the semester. I had one or two of those classes. And let me tell you what the result of the teacher usually telling me that's how the test was going to, or that's how the class was going to go. I would say, awesome, thank you very much. Let me look at the syllabus, see what's going on. How many days can I skip before I actually have to really be there? When do I actually have to study? Do I only have to study like a month before and then I'll be ready? Unfortunately, this kind of produced a result in me where I didn't worry too much, because I knew, hey, there's one test. I'll start studying in November. I'll be good. You know, who cares about August, September, or October? But then there was another type of class that sometimes I would have in college. And this is one where this teacher would get there and hand me the syllabus and say, hey, guess what? When you show up to class, you may have a pop quiz that day. You may not. I'm not gonna tell you. You may show up that day and you'll have something going on, or you may not. And let me tell you what that produced in me. A holy terror. A holy terror, because I knew that if I showed up that day, I couldn't put it off like I was doing with those other classes. I had to be ready to answer. In fact, I had one chemistry class where there's this terrifying man who would just call on people randomly. I mean, he'd be in the middle of teaching something, and then he'd say, what is this answer? And I'd be like, oh my gosh. I always try to figure out, like, if I sit in the very front, will he overlook me? If I sit in the back, can I hide? Usually I figured out like the middle, like the third row is on the right side. That was where I ended up settling for. But I had those two types of classes so often in college. Here's the point. The perspective of the present and how we live in the present looks a whole lot different when you know what the future is going to entail, right? When I knew coming up in those classes, that when I knew that I had a test that was coming way down the road and when it was going to be, the date that it was going to come and be there, I took it easy. Took it easy for several months because I knew I had time to get ready. But when I didn't know when it was coming, when I knew that if I was going to show up that day and they might call on me, I had to be ready no matter what. Think about it. Have you ever watched a suspenseful movie the second time through? Right? It changes the whole experience of the whole movie, right? You know what's going to happen. When I was lying on my sickness bed this week, I went to some of my comfort things, which was one of those comfort things for me is watching old UT football games. And I went back and watched one of the games from last year when I knew Tennessee was going to win. But at the time of the game, I had no idea they were going to win. This second time through, I took it easy. I laid back, I didn't care about missing a play. Like, it was totally fine. I pretended like I was getting excited when I knew, oh no, the other team scored. What's going to happen? I knew what was going to happen, right? The future, the perspective of the present is changed when you know what the future looks like or you don't. And here in this teaching, Jesus is giving us a perspective, a window into the future so that we will be prepared and live appropriately in the present. Right? Jesus says that he's coming back, but he's not going to say when that's going to be. It's funny, churches have this weird kind of relationship with the end times, right? Like some churches and some people seem to be like, in my eyes, they almost seem to be like overly obsessed with the end times. Like it's like almost all they preach about or talk about. They go through and do all this hard work at trying to figure out exactly when Jesus is coming or not. They're obsessed with kind of the end times. In fact, there's this whole like realm of study that is within theology that's based on studying the end times. It's this whole doctrine you can kind of specialize in. And there's a time and there's a place for that. And other churches, on the other hand, seem to never talk about the end times, to never talk about the fact that Jesus is coming again. And the trick, I think, is to find the right kind of balance, to recognize that as Jesus says here, Jesus talks significantly, when you read through the Gospels, he talks significantly about his return, that he will be coming back one day. It is a fact, something we can be assured of. But he also specially emphasizes that when he comes, we won't know exactly when he's coming, and therefore, we should be ready. And in this passage, once again, notice there is no, when the master may be coming back, or if he comes back, Jesus says, no, I will be coming back. And as people who want to follow Jesus, we either think Jesus was a loon and didn't know what he was talking about, he shouldn't be trusted or believed, or we should consider the other thing that this might cause us to believe, and that's that Jesus truly is the King of the universe. And as the King of the universe, we should be compelled to listen to everything he says. And here he is stressing he will be coming back. He will be coming back, and specifically that should come to us as encouragement and as warning. Encouragement and as warning. Let's talk first about some encouragement. We need some encouragement this morning, don't we? Jesus begins with this story about this master of a home who's returning from a wedding feast. And remember, there's no call ahead in these days. He's just going to go to this thing, and he's going to come back one day. And as it says, let's go back to verse 35. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he'll fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes in the middle of the night, the second watch, before midnight, or the third watch, sometime after midnight, blessed are those slaves. Notice here, Jesus is building in room for delay. Even if he comes later, second or third watch, blessed are those he finds waiting and ready. See, this is what I love about Jesus. He knows who we are as people. Right? Jesus is kind to us. He understands our temptation. He understands Luke's audience. He understands that whether this was written, whether we've been waiting for 20 years, maybe like Luke's audience, or 2,000 years like us, he understands the temptation that comes with every day that passes. When Jesus doesn't come back, that little voice whispers in the back of your head, is any of this real? Is Jesus really coming back, or is this just some kind of fantasy world that we're living in? Is Jesus' word really to be trusted? And when Jesus told his disciples here, he says to them, there's going to be some sort of delay. It's not that I'm coming back immediately, and recognize that. Be okay with that. It's kind of like how the psalmist in Psalm 73, it talks about how he was looking onto the world. He was looking onto the wicked. And as he looked onto the world, he thought to himself, what good is it keeping myself being holy? What good is it trusting in God when it seems like the world is just getting worse and all the wicked, all the people that don't care about God just seem to be prospering. And I'm over here trying to keep myself pure and holy and waiting. And what good is it? It's exactly the kind of attitude that Jesus is addressing here. What good is it, sometimes we wonder, waiting for a God who seems to be far off? But Jesus says, no matter the delay, rest assured, I will be back. And when he comes back, notice the surprise of verse 37. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he'll fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. Have you ever thrown a surprise party for somebody and then your guest of honor decided to actually sit you down at the table and then start serving you and say, hey, this cake is here for you, this meal's actually for you, right? It's so backwards. And yet Jesus is saying that's what... Okay, that's what's going to happen. That there'll be this great reversal when Christ comes. That there'll be this amazing thing that happens where the one that we're waiting for actually comes and sits down and serves and waits on us. It's almost as if the master that we're waiting for, who's been at this wedding celebration, is bring the joy and the celebration of the wedding back with him to us. And if you know the plot of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, that is the plot of the Bible. Of a wedding ceremony of God and God and heaven coming and meeting earth and being one day. That Jesus is saying that the reality and the joy of the fullness of the love of God that we taste sometimes only in part. Sometimes you have those moments where God feels so real, and that taste of his goodness is just like this little appetizer. Jesus says there'll be a day when that fullness of God's love, that thing that we sometimes now experience only in part, will be the main course. There'll be no more appetizers. Jesus says there'll be a day when the curse of sin is undone totally and completely. That thing you struggle with, that anxiousness, that sin you have a hard time with, there'll be a day when that's no more. There'll be a day when we won't look onto the news with fear or heartache or heartbreak. It'll be done because heaven and earth will meet fully as they've always intended to be. There'll be a day when the sting of death, when the obituaries, which as one pastor said years ago, when those obituaries start turning into personal letters of our friends and family, when all of those will be done away with and life is fully swallowed up death. Or as C.S. Lewis wrote, when there'll be a day when all the sad things will become untrue. Whew, I'm ready. I don't know about y'all. I'm ready. Come quickly, Lord Jesus. Jesus says, that day is assured, my friends. When you're tempted to lose heart, when you're tempted to give up, that day is coming. And it will be here quickly. And when you're going through one of those long nights, one of those long seasons where it just feels like this darkness is reality, Jesus says that will not be the case forever. His coming back is meant to be an encouragement to us. And I hope we rest in that encouragement, especially on our dark days. But it isn't just meant to be an encouragement, it's also meant to be a warning to us as well. And Jesus gives us those two images to warn us. First, that his coming will be like a thief in the night. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just schedule with your burglar their attempts to break in, right? Like, hey, I'm coming next Friday. Does that work for you? Well, I'm going to be out of town that day. Well, that works for me. No, well, it doesn't really work for me. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just schedule your break-ins? That's not how life works, right? Thieves come when we least expect it. They come when we think everything's fine. And Jesus here, and not just here, probably about 5 or 6 other places in Scripture, compares his return to that of a thief in the night. Coming when you think everything's fine, or coming when you least expect it. Jesus says that's when his return will come. And because of that, we are called to be ready at all times. Be ready at all times. Remember that pop quiz versus the end of semester kind of format of classes. Jesus says his coming is more like a pop quiz. Be ready for his return. The second image he gives is of the Lord of a home going on a trip and setting in charge a servant to look over all of his things as he goes on this trip. And when the master's delayed on this trip, the servant begins to say to himself, wait a minute, who knows when this guy's coming back? You know what I'm going to do? This stuff over here is looking pretty good. I think I'm going to start using it for my own benefit, right? Or these other servants that I've been put in authority over, I'm going to start using my authority to prop myself up a little bit more here. You might have caught this. It's been multiple weeks since we've been back in the beginning of chapter 12 of Luke. But this is actually a callback to the beginning of chapter 12 when Jesus tells the story of the man with bigger barns who starts thinking to himself, oof, I got all this good stuff. I'm going to start using it for myself. Jesus says in his delay of coming back, the temptation to then use everything that God has been given, not to serve others, but to use it for our own benefit, to hoard up our own wealth, to exert our authority over others and not serve others, to make it all about us. That temptation can grow. We cannot let his delay do that. I've got some friends who were telling me this summer that they went on vacation, and they being the kind people that they were, they said, you know what, we've got some students at church that need a little extra money. We're going to let them house sit for us this summer while we go on this trip. I think they went to Italy or somewhere, so they were gone a couple weeks. Well, for one reason or another, their trip got cut a little bit short, and they actually were coming home a little bit early, and they thought, should we tell these students that we're coming home? And they're like, nah, we'll just get there. It'll be fine. Well, they show up, and guess what they see? Cars all over the yard, right? These students that they had put in charge of their home had decided to throw a party because they weren't getting home for another day or two. Can you imagine their surprise when they show up in the middle of this party to their own home and see those people right there, the owners of the home? They didn't get into what happened after that part of it, but I guarantee it was not pretty. Jesus says, hey, don't be throwing any wild parties for yourselves with everything that I've been giving you. Jesus warns us here. In his warning, we laugh about that example there, but his warning is anything but to be laughed at. Some of the harshest words, I don't like reading them because they're so harsh. When Jesus talks about what'll happen, Jesus says that the one who beat and hurt his fellow slaves will receive just as much as he had been given, if not more, when his master returns. The one that had been using what he'd been given to harm and to beat and to tear down others, that same thing will happen to him. See, that's a hard picture to swallow, but God is a God of accountability. God cares about what we do in this life. He cares about this world. He cares about what we've been given. If we use what we've been given, if every word we speak is hurting others, if everything we do is harming others, God cares about that because he cares about us. And so he calls us to remember that everything we've been given, we're to use as he'd have us use. The response there about being cut to pieces, or maybe your translation might say being cut off, I think Jesus is actually calling back to Numbers 15, where in Numbers 15 it says, where in that passage, God makes a distinction between intentional sin and unintentional sin. And he says, if you've committed a sin intentionally, the punishment there is worse than when you commit a sin that's unintentional. And yet they're both sin. And one of the punishments for committing an intentional sin in Numbers 15 in the law was to actually cut you off from the people of God. You actually had to be exiled from the people of God. Could Jesus be alluding to something similar here? Maybe so. Maybe so. But no matter the delay, whether it's 20 years or 2,000 years, whether Christ comes back tomorrow or in 5 years or in 15 or whatever, he has told us that he's coming, that we might be both encouraged and be warned. And this leaves us with a question that we need to wrestle with this morning and this week. Simply this: are we ready? Are you ready for Christ to return? And more specifically, within that question, are you ready? I've been thinking about a few other questions. First, the question is this: am I awake with my lamp lit? This is a callback to that verse 35. Am I awake with my lamp lit? There's kind of two aspects of being awake and alert. If you read the New Testament, you'll see again and again Paul and Peter and others call for the people of God to be alert, be ready. I thought about this, and I thought about a friend of mine one time who told me, it was late one night when he was driving to his grandparents' house, and as he was driving there, it had been a long day, and he found himself getting drowsy at the wheel. And anybody that's found themselves in that place knows how dangerous it is to fall asleep at the wheel. And my friend actually found himself going into a drainage ditch because he ended up falling asleep at the wheel. Christ tells us, the New Testament tells us again and again, be alert, be watchful, be ready, because it is so easy for us to kind of drift into dangerous places, especially when it comes to sin and danger. I remember Jesus' words in the Garden of Gethsemane to his disciples. Watch and pray was his words, so that you may not fall into sin. Paul talks about in Romans 13, 11 through 14. Peter says that the devil is like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour, so stay alert. One of the things that Christ calls us to do is to be watchful and be alert for our own lives. Where are you drifting right now? Where do you find your heart or your mind going to repeatedly? Do you find yourself going to a place that resembles Christ's attitudes? Or do you find yourself maybe going somewhere else? Are there any small sins in your life that you think, it's not so bad? But over time, you find yourself maybe thinking, this is getting a little worse, a little worse, a little worse. Jesus says, be alert. Watch out for the things within your heart, the pessimism in your heart, the cynicism that can grow in there. Be mindful of the way in which you see yourself. Do you see yourself as a servant to serve others, or as someone to be served? Do you see everything revolving around you, or do you see yourself as a servant to the King? Jesus tells us, the New Testament tells us to be alert to prayer. Colossians 4:2 talks about stay alert when it comes to your prayers. There was a 19th century Scottish pastor who, in a letter to a struggling believer, said, do not take up your time so much with studying your own heart as with studying Christ's heart. For one look at yourself, take 10 looks at Christ. And I really like that advice because we're to be watchful of our own hearts, but at the same time, that watchfulness isn't sitting there thinking to ourselves, trying to find every little thing all of the time. That's part of it. But even as much as we look at our own hearts, we're to continue to look more and more at Jesus' heart and to compare the two things. Is my heart like Christ's? Am I encouraging? Am I loving? Am I being gentle? Am I kind? Or do I find these other things growing up within us? And so the question for us is, are you doing that? Are you being watchful? Are you being alert? Do you take time each day or even maybe just each week to sit down and to talk with the Lord and say, Lord, this is where my heart is? Do you keep a journal? Do you journal about where you kind of are in your spiritual life and where maybe God has been wants to lead you? Keeping a journal is a part of the practice of spiritual watchfulness. But not only that, what are you being watchful for others? Who has permission to watch over your life? Who has permission to say, hey, I see something in your life that I want to make sure you're aware of because I think it can be kind of harmful. As parents, you know what this is like. Parents, this is what you do with kids, right? As parents, you're supposed to watch over your kids. It's a part of what it means to raise up your kids, to be watchful over them, to see what's going on in their lives and to call out things that aren't right and to call forth the things that are good and holy and well. But what about your marriages? In your marriage, are we being watchful of our marriage? Do you find yourself drifting? How many times have I heard the story or have you read of the story of spouses just slowly drifting away for whatever reason? Right? They don't intend it. Maybe it's nothing intentional, but if we're not careful and watchful, we can find ourselves in trouble. It reminds me of what it's like growing up out in the woods, like where I grew up in Nolensville. When I went as a kid, you'd go out and play in the woods, and when you'd come back in, one of the first things Mom would say? Hey, you need to check yourself for ticks, right? Like, you need to look over yourself. And, I would do the best I could. I'd pull off one here or there, but there was always some place I'd say, Mom, I can't see the back of my head. Or I'd say, Dad, can you help? And so you'd actually literally have to have someone else help you look for ticks. And as a church body, as a church family, that is one of our primary responsibilities. I need Chris to come to me and say, hey, Paul, here's what I'm seeing in your life, and I want you to be aware of it out of a spirit of love, right? I'm called to do that as your pastor as well. We are called to a spirit of holy watchfulness out of love for one another. So the question, are you ready? First of all, is are you awake? Are you alert? Are you being watchful for your own soul, and are you being watchful for what Christ is doing within you? But secondly, the next question is, are your loins girded for action? That's the more literal translation there of what Jesus says in verse 35. Are your loins girded for action? I know we don't say that so much anymore. Back in the day, they had these long robes that they would wear, and when it was time to get busy working, when it was time to actually serve, they'd literally have to hike up their robes, and they'd get a belt and fasten it around their robes so that everything would be, functional for movement. Maybe, I don't know, ladies with long dresses, maybe you know what that's like. I don't know. But anyway, the point is, Jesus says, hey, there are times when it comes to, are you ready? The question is, are you ready to serve? Like, one of the things for the past 2 weeks, as I've been meditating on this, is just this relationship of master and servant. We think and it's true. I mean, we have all these images of our relationship with Jesus. He's our friend, right? What a friend we have in Jesus. Hebrews 2 gives us this image of Jesus as our elder brother. Of course, we talk about Jesus as our Savior, absolutely. But one of the primary ones as well is that Jesus is the master and that we are his slaves. And some of our Bible translations try to be really kind and they say servants, and that's not wrong. But the literal word there is slave. I know that's an uncomfortable word for us. It's uncomfortable for me, but that's what it talks about here, that Jesus is our master and we are called to serve him. Think about it. There's no negotiation of duty. There's no talk about what's in it for me, right? There's no excuses or anything. Jesus says, I'm the master and you are the slaves. And as someone who's been claimed by Jesus, that's the question. Is Jesus truly your master? Is Jesus truly have say over your life? Or are there plenty of places where you say, Jesus, I'll do this, but, you can't tell me to do this over here. I'll keep being the master of my life over here. Or does Jesus have full range, full access? Does he call the shots, or do we call the shots? It's so easy to structure our lives where we can say to Jesus, I'm sorry, I'm just too busy, or I just got too much going on. And Jesus says, look, I'm the master, right? Like, are we willing to build our lives around that or not? Are we ready to serve the master? Are you alert? Are you awake? Are you ready to serve the master? Are your loins girded for action, as the text says? And then finally, the last thing is, are we ready? Am I ready to stand before the master? Are we truly ready to stand before the Master? Believe it or not, I think every person, whether you call yourself a Christian, everybody wants Jesus to return. Everybody does. Or at least they want the effects of Jesus' return. Because every single one of us, whether you know Jesus or not, there's something within all of our hearts that longs for the world to be made right. Right? We long for an end to injustice. Right? We long for an end to evil and death and hate and hurt. Like everybody longs for those things. We all do. And the beautiful story of our faith is that, of God, is that there is a king who is coming to set those things right, to answer that longing in our heart of a day when all things will be made new. That's the beauty of our faith. One of the beautiful things about it. Again, he's coming to be against those who, as Jesus says in the passage, who beat and abuse their fellow humans, and who use the resources God has given not to care for others, but to retain an excess for themselves. Jesus is coming to set that right. Everyone longs for that. The rub comes with the fact that, that it begins not with people out there like we want it to. It begins right here. When we long for Jesus to return, what we're really saying is, Jesus, I long for you to bring accountability to this world, and it starts right here with me. Because the justice of God is not abstract. It never begins out there in the world against those people we think are the problem. But it always begins right here within our own hearts. It begins with me, and it begins with you. Because there'll be a day, that day that Christ comes will also be a day when we stand before the Master. And sooner or later, we will have no more excuses. And we'll have to consider how we've spent our lives. How have you spent your life? Have you spent it faithfully and prudently? Have you used everything Christ has given you well? When we long for that justice for Christ to return, will we be ready? And you might be thinking, as I have thought many times, how can anybody stand before the Master if that's the case? If Christ is truly coming, if he knows the depths of the thoughts of my heart, if he knows truly all the evil that I have done, all the evil I have thought, all the hatred that I've had toward people, how can anybody stand before the Master? How can anyone avoid being cut to pieces? But my friends, I want to remind you that the best way to prepare for Christ's second coming is to remember his first coming. The key verse for us this morning is verse 37. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt. Literally, he will gird his loins and have them sit down to eat, and he will come serve them. Do you know how radical this would have been to hear in Jesus' day? That the master has come to serve the servants? Masters don't get home in the middle of the night or get home ever and say, oh, I'm so glad I'm home. I'm here to now serve you guys. Right? He doesn't gather the slaves at the dinner table and begin serving them. Masters don't treat their servants like honored guests, and yet our master does. The one that we serve is the one who came first and who offered his life as a service, as a ransom for our own. As I hear this verse 37, as I think about this master arriving in this home and gathering the people in his household together and sitting them down and serving them, I picture the Last Supper. And I picture Jesus saying during that Last Supper in John 15:15, I do not call you slaves any longer, because a slave does not know what the master is doing, but I call you friends, because I have made known everything that I've heard from my Father. And I hear Jesus say, this is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you. In other words, the good news is that Jesus is the master. He is the servant who followed God, who became that servant, who stood in the place of the unfaithful servant that you and I am. He is the one that when we fall short, when we aren't ready, when we do everything we shouldn't do, when we're the ones who beat and hurt others, when we're the ones who out of selfishness hoard everything for ourselves and don't care about others, Jesus is the master who came and sat us down and gave his life so that we would never be cut off from God. Jesus was the one who was literally broken and cut to pieces so that we wouldn't have to be. And that the nature of God, if anyone wants to ask you, if anyone understands what the nature of God is, that is the nature of God. It's His love for us. It's his love for us that we might be included in His covenant promises. And so the best way to prepare for the judgment of God that's coming in the second coming of Christ, that will cut all the way to your heart and mind, is to fully embrace Jesus in His first coming. To embrace His life, His death, His resurrection. And it's to ask ourselves, do we truly love Him? Or better yet, do you know how much He truly loves you? Do you know how much He was willing to give for you? How tenderly and how graciously He wants to sit you down at the table and say, you have a place here with me. And it's a place that will never be taken from you. Friends, as individuals, as a church, are we awake? Are we watchful? Are we ready? Are we caring for one another enough to be mindful of looking into one another's lives with love? Are we ready for action? Do we truly just see Christ as our master, or do we just want the church to revolve around serving ourselves? And are we ready to stand before our crucified Lord in worship and thanksgiving, in gratitude for the one who was cut to pieces on our behalf? Let's pray.